July 18, 1944. Normandy, France. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sits in his command post, staring at intelligence reports scattered across his desk. His hand trembles slightly as he reads the same name for the third time in 3 weeks. Guy Simonds. A Canadian general he's never met, never fought, never even heard of until 21 days ago. But now this name haunts him. Rommel calls for his chief of staff. When the officer enters, the desert fox looks up with eyes that have seen too many battles, predicted too many outcomes. He speaks in a low voice, almost a whisper. This Canadian, Simonds, he's different from the others. Watch him closely. He thinks like we do. The chief of staff nods politely. But Rommel sees it in his expression. The doubt. The dismissal. Another Canadian general? What threat could he possibly pose? The Germans have been holding the line against Montgomery for weeks. The British can barely move. And now Rommel is worried about some colonial officer from across the Atlantic? But Rommel knows something his generals don't. He studied the after-action reports from the first 3 weeks of Simonds' operations. The patterns. The methods. The cold, calculated aggression. This isn't another cautious British commander playing by the rulebook. This is something else entirely. 3 days later, Rommel is proven right. But by then it's too late for him to do anything about it. An Allied fighter strafes his staff car on a country road. Rommel suffers a fractured skull, torn from command at the worst possible moment. His warning about Simonds? It dies with his departure. The other generals file it away. Forget about it. Ignore it completely. They would pay for that mistake with the complete destruction of Hitler's most fanatical division. Let me take you back to understand how we got here. How one Canadian general, unknown and underestimated, became the nightmare that Rommel saw coming but couldn't stop. Guy Granville Simonds wasn't supposed to be a legend. Born in England but raised in Canada, he was quiet, methodical, almost boring compared to the flashy American generals or the aristocratic British commanders. He didn't give rousing speeches. He didn't slap soldiers or curse at his staff. He just thought, calculated, planned. And when he moved with devastating precision. By July 1944, Simonds commanded the 2nd Canadian Corps. On paper, this made him subordinate to British General Bernard Montgomery, who commanded all Allied ground forces in Normandy. But Montgomery recognized something special in Simonds. A tactical mind that operated on a different frequency. So Montgomery gave him something precious. Autonomy. Freedom to plan and execute operations his own way. The Germans had no idea what was coming. Now understand the situation. After D-Day, the Allies are stuck. Bogged down in the hedgerows of Normandy. Every field is a fortress. Every tree line hides machine guns. The Germans have turned this beautiful French countryside into a killing ground. And holding the line south of Caen? The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Hitler Youth. These aren't regular soldiers. These are fanatics. Teenagers and 20-year-olds who grew up in Nazi Germany, indoctrinated from childhood, trained to worship Hitler, to die for the Reich without question. Their average age is 18. Their combat effectiveness? Among the highest of any German unit in France. They've been fighting the Canadians since June 7th, 1 day after D-Day. And they've been winning. The 12th SS has stopped every Canadian attack cold. They've inflicted horrific casualties. They've executed Canadian prisoners of war in cold blood. They've earned a reputation for brutality that makes even other SS units uncomfortable. And they're proud of it. Their commander, Kurt Meyer, is only 33 years old. The youngest divisional commander in the German military. Aggressive. Ruthless. Brilliant in defense. Meyer has beaten the Canadians so many times that he stopped taking them seriously. British commanders? Predictable. Canadian commanders? Even more so. They attack the same way every time. Artillery barrage. Infantry advance. Tank support. All by the book. All easily countered. But Meyer hasn't fought Simonds yet. Not really. Not when Simonds is actually in command and planning the operation himself. This is what Rommel saw in those first 3 weeks. Rommel understood that Simonds wasn't following the British playbook. He was writing his own. And that made him dangerous in a way that Meyer and the other German generals couldn't comprehend. Because they'd grown comfortable. Arrogant. They'd stopped the Allies for 6 weeks. Held them in a narrow beachhead. Convinced themselves that German military superiority would prevail despite the odds. Despite the endless Allied resources. Despite everything. Rommel tried to warn them. But Rommel was gone. And Kurt Meyer was about to learn a lesson that would destroy his entire division. August 7, 1944. Simonds sits in his headquarters, smoking his pipe, reviewing maps. His staff officers watch him nervously. They know that look, that absolute focus. He's planning something big, something unprecedented. The British have finally captured Caen after weeks of brutal fighting. But south of Caen lies open terrain. The Caen Plain. 12 miles of gently rolling farmland with clear fields of fire. Perfect tank country. Perfect killing ground for defenders. And the Germans have it fortified in depth. Multiple defensive lines. Artillery pre-registered on every approach. The 12th SS Panzer Division and several other German units dug in and waiting. Every Allied general who's looked at this terrain has come to the same conclusion. Attacking across it would be suicide. The Germans would see you coming from miles away. Their guns would tear you apart before you got close. It's impossible. Simonds looks at the same terrain and sees something different. He sees an opportunity. But only if he throws out every conventional rule of warfare. He calls his staff together and presents his plan. Operation Totalize. They listen in stunned silence. What he's proposing has never been done before. Not on this scale. Not in modern warfare. First, Simonds says we attack at night. Complete darkness. No preliminary bombardment to warn them we're coming. We use the night to close the distance before they can react. His officers exchange glances. Night attacks are notoriously difficult. Units get lost. Coordination breaks down. Friendly fire becomes almost inevitable. The British tried a night attack earlier in the campaign and it was a disaster. Simonds isn't finished. Second, he says we don't navigate by landmarks or compasses. We navigate by tracer fire. I'll have the RAF fly overhead and drop colored markers along our axis of advance. The tanks and infantry will follow the tracers like a road in the sky. We'll also have searchlights bouncing light off the clouds to create artificial moonlight. The officers look at each other. This is insane. Using enemy anti-aircraft fire to guide an advance? Searchlights to illuminate the battlefield? It's brilliant or it's suicide. They're not sure which. Third, Simonds continues, we don't attack with infantry in the open. We convert tanks into armored personnel carriers. Strip out the guns, pack them with infantry. The soldiers ride inside steel boxes all the way to the objective. Protected. Fast. Concentrated. Now his staff is openly skeptical. Converting tanks into personnel carriers? That's desperate. That's what you do when you've run out of real armored vehicles. And the converted tanks won't have their main guns. They'll be helpless if they're attacked. But Simonds has thought of everything. The converted tanks, he explains, will be mixed with regular tanks and self-propelled artillery. A combined arms force moving as one massive column. Speed and shock. We punch through their forward defenses before they can coordinate a response. By the time they realize what's happening, we'll be 5 miles behind their front line. Fourth, and this is where Simonds reveals his genius, we use heavy bombers. Not on their front line, that's expected. We bomb their rear areas. Their command posts. Their artillery positions. Their reserves. We blind them. We cut their communications. We prevent them from organizing a counterattack. We hit them everywhere except where they expect it. And fifth, the final piece, we don't stop. Conventional doctrine says you pause after the initial breakthrough to consolidate, regroup, let your logistics catch up. Simonds says no. We keep moving. Day and night. We don't give them time to recover. We don't let them establish a new defensive line. We push until they break completely. The officers leave the briefing shaken. This plan violates every principle they've been taught. But there's something about the way Simonds explains it. The calm confidence. The attention to detail. The way he's anticipated every objection, solved every problem before they've even raised it. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. Across the lines, Kurt Meyer receives intelligence about increased Canadian activity. More tanks moving into position. More infantry concentrations. He's seen this before. Another clumsy British-style attack. He adjusts his defenses, repositions his artillery, and waits. Whatever the Canadians are planning, the 12th SS will stop it. They always do. Meyer's greatest weakness is his strength. He's beaten the Allies so many times that he can't imagine losing. He knows his troops are superior. His junior officers have more combat experience than most Allied battalion commanders. His men fight with fanatical courage. And the terrain favors defense completely. What Meyer doesn't know is that Simonds has studied every one of the 12th SS defensive victories. He's analyzed their tactics, identified their patterns, found their weaknesses. And he's designed Operation Totalize specifically to exploit those weaknesses. The night of August 7th is moonless. Perfect darkness blankets the Caen plain. German sentries peer into the blackness, seeing nothing, hearing nothing unusual. Just another quiet night. Some of them joke about how the Canadians haven't attacked in weeks. Maybe they've given up. Maybe the war is winding down. At 11:30 p.m. the world explodes. 1,000 British and Canadian artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. Not on the German front line. On their rear areas. Command posts. Communication centers. Artillery batteries. The Germans scramble to respond, but their phone lines are cut. Their radio nets are jammed. Orders can't get through. Reserves can't be moved. It's chaos. Then the bombers come. RAF heavy bombers, hundreds of them, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on the German rear. The earth shakes. Buildings collapse. Entire headquarters staffs are buried alive. The carefully prepared German defensive system begins to disintegrate from the inside out. And in the darkness, unseen, unheard beneath the bombardment, the Canadian armor moves forward. 300 tanks and converted personnel carriers, moving in massive columns guided by tracer fire and artificial moonlight. They advance at 20 miles per hour across terrain where everyone said armor couldn't attack at night. The German forward positions don't know what's happening until the Canadian tanks are literally on top of them. Machine gun nests are overrun before they can fire a shot. Forward observation posts are crushed under tank treads. By the time the Germans realize they're under attack, the Canadians are already through their first defensive line. Meyer tries to call his forward units. Static. He tries his artillery. No response. He sends runners. They disappear into the chaos. For the first time in his career, Kurt Meyer doesn't know what's happening on his own battlefield. He's blind. And the Canadians are coming. By dawn on August 8th, Simonds' forces have advanced 7 miles. 7 miles in a single night through supposedly impenetrable defenses. They've punched a massive hole in the German line. They've captured thousands of prisoners. They've destroyed dozens of German tanks and hundreds of vehicles. And they're still moving. Meyer finally gets communication with his remaining units. The reports are catastrophic. The forward defenses have collapsed. Several battalions have been overrun. The Canadians are behind the main defensive line. And they're not stopping. They're pushing south with mechanical precision, rolling up German positions from the rear. Meyer does what he's always done. He orders a counterattack. Throw everything at them. Stop them cold. The 12th SS has never failed before. But this time is different. This time, Simonds anticipated the counterattack. He's positioned his reserves perfectly. When the German armor charges forward, they run straight into a trap. Canadian anti-tank guns and fresh tank units waiting in ambush. The German counterattack is shattered. Dozens of panzers burn on the Normandy plain. For the first time, the 12th SS Panzer Division is reeling. For the first time, they're not winning. They're losing. Badly. Now remember, Rommel warned them about this. 3 weeks earlier, he told his staff that Simonds was different. That he thought differently. That he was dangerous. They ignored him. They thought Rommel was being paranoid. How could a Canadian general possibly threaten the Wehrmacht's finest? But Rommel had seen what they refused to see. He'd recognized a pattern in Simonds' tactics that reminded him of the best German commanders. Aggressive but calculated. Willing to take risks but only after eliminating as many variables as possible. Using combined arms not as separate elements but as a single integrated weapon system. Rommel had fought the British in North Africa. He knew how they thought. How they planned. How they fought. And Simonds didn't fight like a British general. He fought like a German general who happened to be wearing a Canadian uniform. That's what made him so dangerous. The Germans knew how to fight the British. They'd been doing it for 4 years. But fighting someone who used their own methods against them? They had no answer for that. August 8th becomes August 9th. Simonds doesn't pause. Doesn't consolidate. He keeps pushing. His tanks advance through the day and into the next night. German units that try to establish new defensive lines find Canadian armor already behind them before they're fully deployed. It's a nightmare for the defenders. Nothing they do works. Every defensive position is flanked. Every counterattack is anticipated and defeated. The 12th SS Panzer Division is dissolving. Not in a single dramatic battle, but in 100 small engagements where they're constantly off balance, always reacting, never able to seize the initiative. Their casualties mount. Their fuel runs low. Their ammunition stocks dwindle. Meyer tries everything. He pulls units from other sectors. He reorganizes his battalions. He personally leads counterattacks. Nothing works. For every position they hold, the Canadians bypass 2 others. For every Canadian tank they knock out, 3 more appear. It's like fighting a flood. You can't stop it. You can only hope to survive it. On August 10th, things get worse. Simonds launches the second phase of his offensive. Operation Tractable. Another night attack. Another massive bombardment. Another armored thrust through terrain that's supposed to be impassable. The 12th SS has been retreating for 3 days straight. They're exhausted. Low on everything. And now the Canadians are coming again. This time Meyer knows they can't hold. The division is combat ineffective. They've lost too much. Taken too many casualties. Used up too much material. If they stay, they'll be encircled and destroyed. He gives the order he never thought he'd give. Retreat. Fall back. Save what's left of the division. But retreating is almost harder than defending. The roads are clogged with burning vehicles. Allied fighter bombers strafe everything that moves. Canadian armor pursues relentlessly. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler's elite fanatics, the unit that stopped the Canadians cold for 2 months, is running for its life. By August 14th, the 12th SS has been pushed back 20 miles. They've lost over 80% of their armor. 60% of their personnel are casualties. Their artillery is gone. Their supply trains are destroyed. What's left of the division is scattered across the Norman countryside in small, disorganized groups trying to escape the closing Allied trap. Kurt Meyer is captured on September 6th. The youngest divisional commander in the German military. The man who beat the Canadians again and again for 2 months. Captured by the same Canadians he'd underestimated. During his interrogation, Meyer keeps asking about the Canadian general who planned the attacks. Who was he? Where did he learn to fight like that? How did he anticipate every German move? When they tell him it was Simonds, Meyer just shakes his head. He's never heard the name before. This unknown Canadian general has destroyed his division, ended his career, and Meyer didn't even know his name until it was over. But here's the real tragedy. Rommel knew. Rommel warned them. If Rommel had stayed in command, if his generals had listened, if they'd taken Simonds seriously from the beginning, maybe the 12th SS would have survived. Maybe they would have deployed differently. Maybe they would have recognized the threat and adapted. Instead, they ignored the warning. Dismissed it. Considered themselves superior to any colonial general. And they paid for that arrogance with the complete destruction of one of Germany's most powerful divisions. Simonds' victory wasn't just tactical. It was psychological. He proved that the German military could be beaten at its own game. That the Wehrmacht wasn't invincible. That careful planning and innovative tactics could overcome even the most fanatical defenders. He broke the myth of German superiority on the Normandy battlefield. The numbers tell the story. Operation Totalize intractable advanced Allied forces 15 miles in 1 week through defenses that had held for 2 months. They destroyed or crippled 4 German divisions including the 12th SS. They captured over 5,000 prisoners. They killed or wounded over 10,000 German soldiers. And they did it with fewer casualties than any comparable offensive in the Normandy campaign. But the real measure of Simonds' victory isn't in the statistics. It's in what happened next. The Falaise Gap. The encirclement of German Army Group B. The destruction of the German forces in Normandy. None of that would have been possible without Simonds breaking through at Caen Falaise. His operations created the conditions for the collapse of the entire German position in France. Within months, Paris was liberated. Within a year, Germany was defeated. And it all started with one Canadian general who thought differently, fought differently, and refused to accept the conventional wisdom that attacking across the Caen Falaise plain was impossible. Rommel saw it coming. He recognized that Simonds was something special. Something dangerous. He tried to warn his fellow generals. But they wouldn't listen. Couldn't listen. They were too confident in their own abilities, too dismissive of Allied capabilities, too certain that German military doctrine was superior. The Desert Fox knew better. He'd fought enough campaigns, faced enough opponents, studied enough battles to recognize true tactical genius when he saw it. And he saw it in Guy Simonds after just 3 weeks of operations. 3 weeks was all it took for Rommel to understand that this quiet Canadian general was going to change the course of the war. But by the time Rommel's warning might have mattered, he was gone. Wounded. Removed from command. And eventually forced to commit suicide after being implicated in the plot to kill Hitler. His final warning about Simonds was forgotten in the chaos of Germany's collapse. The other German generals learned too late. Some never learned at all. They kept making the same assumptions, fighting the same way, expecting the same results. And they kept losing. Not because they were bad commanders but because they refused to adapt. refused to acknowledge that the other side might produce leaders as capable as their own, refused to believe that a Canadian general from a nation they considered militarily insignificant could outthink and outfight the Wehrmacht. Kurt Meyer survived the war. He was tried for war crimes, convicted, and imprisoned. After his release, he wrote his memoirs. In them, he's honest about the defeat at Caen. He admits that the Canadians under Simonds fought better than he expected, that their tactics surprised him, that their night attacks were unprecedented and effective. But you can tell he still doesn't fully understand what happened. How he could lose so decisively to an opponent he'd beaten so many times before. He never quite grasped that Simonds studied him, analyzed his methods, identified his patterns, and designed operations specifically to exploit his weaknesses. Meyer was a tactically gifted commander, but he fought reactively. He responded to threats as they emerged. Simonds fought proactively. He created conditions that forced the Germans to respond exactly how he wanted them to respond. And by the time they realized they were being manipulated, it was too late. This is the lesson that Rommel understood and tried to communicate. That underestimating your enemy is the fastest way to defeat. That assuming superiority based on past victories is dangerous. That every opponent deserves respect and careful analysis. The Germans had won so many battles in the early years of the war that they started to believe their own propaganda. Started to think they were inherently better than their enemies. Started to dismiss anyone who wasn't German as militarily inferior. Rommel never made that mistake. He fought the British in North Africa and respected them even as he beat them. He fought the Americans in Tunisia and recognized their potential even when they were inexperienced. And when he encountered Simonds in Normandy, he saw immediately that this was a commander of exceptional ability. Someone who would be extremely dangerous if given the opportunity. He tried to sound the alarm. Tried to get his fellow generals to pay attention. To adjust their defensive plans. To take the Canadian threat seriously. But they couldn't see it. Didn't want to see it. Were too invested in their own sense of superiority to acknowledge that a threat existed. And so the 12th SS Panzer Division was destroyed. Not in a fair fight between equals, but in a systematic dismantling by a superior tactical mind who had done his homework. Simonds knew everything about the 12th SS. Their doctrine, their tendencies, their strengths, their weaknesses. Meyer knew almost nothing about Simonds. He didn't even know his name until after the battle was over. That's the real story here. Not just that Rommel warned his generals. Not just that they ignored him. But why they ignored him. Because accepting his warning would have meant accepting that they might not be the best. That the Allies might produce commanders as good as or better than themselves. That German military superiority was a myth, not a fact. And they couldn't accept that. It contradicted everything they believed about themselves and their nation. So they ignored the warning. And they lost the 12th SS. And then they lost France. And then they lost the war. Could it have been different? Maybe. If Rommel had stayed in command. If his warnings had been heeded. If the Germans had taken Simonds seriously from the beginning and adjusted their defenses accordingly. But that's not what happened. What happened was a perfect storm of German arrogance meeting Canadian innovation. And the Germans came out on the losing side. Guy Simonds never became famous the way Patton or Montgomery did. He was too quiet. Too professional. Too focused on winning battles rather than winning publicity. But the German generals who fought him knew. They knew he was one of the best Allied commanders of the war. Maybe the best. He just didn't care about anyone knowing it except his enemies on the battlefield. After the war, military historians studied Simonds' operations in detail. Operation Totalize in particular became a case study in innovative tactics. Night attacks with massed armor. Navigation by tracer fire. Converted tanks as armored personnel carriers. Continuous operations without pause. Deep bombardment of rear areas. Combined arms integration. Many of these concepts became standard doctrine in modern armies. Simonds invented or refined them all in the cauldron of Normandy in August 1944. But at the time he was just a Canadian general that most people had never heard of. Fighting in a sector that got less attention than the American breakout at St. Lo. Winning battles that didn't make headlines. Destroying German divisions that were quickly forgotten in the larger narrative of the war. History tends to remember the flashy commanders. The ones who give quotable speeches and cultivate relationships with journalists. Simonds wasn't that type of commander. He just won. Consistently. Decisively. Against opponents who thought they were better than him. Rommel would have appreciated the irony. He was famous, admired, legendary. Known as the Desert Fox. Respected by allies and enemies alike. And he saw the danger in Simonds immediately. But the other German generals, the ones who weren't famous, who didn't have legendary reputations, couldn't see it. They were too busy being confident in their own abilities to recognize exceptional ability in someone else. The fall of the 12th SS Panzer Division wasn't just a military defeat. It was a failure of intelligence in every sense of the word. A failure to gather intelligence about the enemy. A failure to analyze that intelligence properly. A failure to act on the intelligence you have. And most fundamentally, a failure of intellectual humility. The inability to admit that you might not have all the answers. That the enemy might surprise you. That someone you've never heard of might be better than you. That's what killed the 12th SS. Not Canadian tanks or artillery or air power, though those all played their part. What killed them was the certainty of their commanders that they couldn't possibly lose to someone like Guy Simonds. A colonial. A Canadian. An unknown. Someone who hadn't attended German military academies. Someone who didn't have the benefit of German military tradition. Someone who was supposed to be inferior by definition. Rommel tried to tell them. The Desert Fox, legendary commander, victor of dozens of battles, respected by friend and foe, tried to warn them that this assumption was wrong. That Simonds was different. That he was dangerous. And they ignored him. Because acknowledging that Rommel was right would have meant admitting that everything they believed about German superiority was wrong. And they'd rather lose the battle than admit they were wrong. So they lost the battle. And the division. And eventually the war. All because they couldn't listen to a warning that threatened their worldview. All because they confused confidence with competence. All because they believed that past victories guaranteed future success. All because they underestimated an opponent they'd never bothered to study. This is the legacy of Guy Simonds. Not just tactical innovation, though that was important. Not just operational success, though that was decisive. But the demonstration that military excellence isn't tied to nationality or tradition or reputation. That careful analysis and creative thinking can overcome even the most formidable opponents. That the ability to learn and adapt matters more than the ability to follow doctrine. That underestimating your enemy, no matter how many times you've beaten him before, is the surest path to defeat. The Germans learned this lesson in the fields and towns south of Caen in August 1944. They learned it the hard way in blood and fire and shattered divisions. They learned it too late to save the 12th SS or change the outcome of the campaign. But they learned it. Eventually. After ignoring Rommel's warning. After dismissing the threat. After losing what they thought was unlosable. 3 weeks. That's all it took Rommel to recognize the danger. 21 days of watching Simonds operate, studying his methods, understanding his mind. And the Desert Fox knew. He saw what was coming. He tried to sound the alarm. But by the time his fellow generals might have listened, Rommel was gone and the trap was already closing. The story of Rommel's warning about Simonds is a story about hubris. About the danger of believing your own propaganda. About the fatal flaw of assuming that past success predicts future victory. About the importance of respecting your enemy, studying your enemy, understanding that your enemy might be just as smart and just as capable as you are. Maybe more so. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was one of the most effective German military units of World War II. They fought with fanatical courage. They won dozens of engagements against Allied forces. They held their sector of the Normandy line for 2 months against overwhelming odds. And then they met a general who understood them better than they understood themselves. Who studied their methods and devised tactics specifically designed to beat them. Who didn't care about their reputation or their ideology or their combat record. Who just analyzed them as a military problem and solved that problem with ruthless efficiency. Guy Simonds destroyed the 12th SS not because he had better soldiers or more tanks or superior firepower, though all of those helped. He destroyed them because he outthought them. Because he planned better. Because he innovated while they relied on past success. Because he respected them as dangerous opponents while they dismissed him as just another Allied general. Because he was willing to try something new while they kept doing what had always worked before. Rommel saw all of this in 3 weeks. The other German generals never saw it at all. Not until it was over. Not until the 12th SS was shattered. Not until the Falaise Gap was closing and German Army Group B was being destroyed. And by then it didn't matter what they saw or understood. It was too late. The battle was over. The campaign was lost. And all because they ignored a warning from the one man who understood what they were facing. That's the real tragedy of this story. Not just that the Germans lost. Not just that the 12th SS was destroyed. But that it could have been avoided. If they'd listened. If they'd paid attention. If they'd taken Simonds seriously from the beginning. But they didn't. Couldn't. Wouldn't. And so they learned the hard way that in war, underestimating your enemy isn't just a mistake. It's a death sentence. 3 weeks. 1 warning. 1 ignored prediction. And the loss of an entire division. That's the price of arrogance on the battlefield. That's the cost of assuming superiority without evidence. That's what happens when you stop respecting your enemy's ability to surprise you, outthink you, and beat you at your own game. The Germans paid that price in the summer of 1944. General Guy Simonds, the quiet Canadian general that nobody had heard of, collected the bill.